RMS Queen Mary, Queen of the Queens by William J. Duncan. Chapter 7. Her New Luxury Years. Her brass polished, her decks caulked and wholly stoned bleach white, her woods restored to look like new veneer, and her bulkheads freshly painted. The Queen had her old glamour as she loaded 1,867 passengers on board at Southampton, July 31st, 1947, for her first peacetime voyage since the bleak September day in 1939. The Queen Elizabeth had been handling passenger trade for almost a year, and now she was making ready to sail from New York on a parallel eastbound voyage, a route planned for the two Leviathans before either vessel was built. The two giant queens would sail in opposite directions for the next 20 years, on timetables as regular as train schedules, passing each other in mid-Atlantic with a horn salute. A tall, graying American, Major General William J. Donovan, who headed the Office of Strategic Service in World War II, was a passenger on board. He had been touring Europe to inspect the tightening of the Iron Curtain and would, like Churchill, sound a warning for a world at peace only 2 years. It was an uneventful crossing, slower than the Queen's previous luxury trips, but when she arrived in New York, the city, which had always been partial to the Queen Mary, let loose the pre-war paean to greet the stately three-stacker as she sailed up the Hudson. Bands were playing, boats were tooting, and people were cheering. The monarch had regained her throne. Donovan told a dockside press conference that the Russians were engaging in psychological warfare and warned that it was going to be a long time before America could pull her troops out of Europe. He predicted a Cold War. Captain Illingworth, asked by a newsman why the Queen was so slow on this trip and why she hadn't tried for a new speed record, snapped, "Why should we? We hold the record now, and after all, it costs money to burn the extra fuel to obtain the added burst of speed." The Queen Elizabeth, younger and seasoned by war, had set no speed records either, and she never would exceed the Queen Mary's August 1938 record. On her turnaround voyage, the Queen carried Lady Nancy Astor, the Virginia-born former member of the British Parliament, Senator Elmer Thomas of Oklahoma, and Congressman Orville Zimmerman of Missouri, who were en route to a United Nations conference on agriculture in Geneva, and Mrs. Edna Blue, chairman of the Foster Parents Plan for War Children, Incorporated, who was headed for Europe on a 7-week tour to find needy children for Americans to help. Also on board was Lady Peel, the former actress Beatrice Lillie, who said she was still wondering when this place would get to England. A young American actress was aboard too, Elizabeth Taylor, 15 years old. The Mary was her old self. She had all the opulence of an old British hotel built into her. The bathtub in one of her first-class staterooms was so large it would take up the entire bathroom space in a comparable compartment on other passenger liners. Even tourist-class cabins were large and spacious. There was something different about this ship. "I can't tell you exactly what it is," said Harold Blakey, a crewman who served her since the maiden voyage. "She is aged for a ship, but she still has that graceful, beautiful look of a real lady. She is like a child that almost died at birth. There is something special in the way you treat such a child, regardless of her age." The crewmen felt that way about the Mary. They made the passengers feel that way too. The cuisine on the Queen Mary was among the best served anywhere in the world. Cunard trained its chefs in the world's leading restaurants before allowing them aboard a luxury liner like the Queen Mary. They had to excel in every form of preparing a meal. There were few dishes the chefs could not prepare, and they were so confident of this that the daily menu challenged the diner to order something they couldn't prepare. "A Greek lady at my table once asked for couscous," said Don Beasley, a Cunard waiter on the Queen Mary from 1958 to 1965. When the wheat and lamb steamed stew arrived, it won Grecian accolades. Southerners could get hominy grits for breakfast, but when they ordered Dr. Pepper, Cunard waiters went blank. The beverage, a favorite of Southerners, was never carried on the Queen Mary, a fact which caused one Cockney waiter to ask a passenger from Georgia, "Is this Dr. Pepper a health drink?" Breakfast offered 80 choices of food, from ham and eggs to 11 different cereals and 5 kinds of toast. Tea was from Ceylon, India and China, and high tea at 4:30 p.m. each day was as much a Queen Mary ritual as it is in Highburn. Such a variety of crumpets were served with tea that these delicacies proved to be the downfall of a brazen stowaway who was feeding himself at tea time in the first-class lounge. The stewards noticed he was a bit piggish about taking too many sweets. The evening meal was a 7-course dinner, and only once in the Queen's luxury years, on November 6, 1947, did passengers have to miss this sumptuous meal and settle for sandwiches. 2,000 passengers were aboard in Southampton for the westward voyage. When they went to the dining room for the evening meal, they discovered 500 crewmen, mostly waiters, stewards, and cooks, had walked off in a wildcat strike. Among those eating cold sandwiches that night were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Mr. and Mrs. Harold S. Vanderbilt. The strike was settled the next day, and the Mary sailed for New York. The strike had delayed her sailing, and she was late arriving in New York. To keep up her schedule, crewmen and shore personnel began a whirlwind operation to load her for a quick turnabout. When she sailed November 12th, she had a turnabout record of 25 hours and 35 minutes. The passenger list was like her early days. Among the 1,525 passengers were Bob Hope, Loretta Young, Robert Montgomery, Alexis Smith, Jennifer Jones, Noel Coward, Wesley Ruggles, Lee Ephraim, and novelist Daphne du Maurier. Bob Hope entertained the passengers in the main lounge for 3 nights straight, but all the hurry to turn around was in vain. A storm delayed her arrival in Southampton 12 hours. Storms at sea continued to plague the two Queens' schedules. Quick turnarounds became a contest to keep up the timetables. In February 1948, the Queen Mary set a record of just 5 minutes over 24 hours in getting back to sea. Passengers seldom realized the colossal job of reloading a ship the size of the Queen Mary. To do it in 24 hours is a Herculean task, but the Queen Mary broke her own record by turning around in 23 hours and 35 minutes, April 8th. Fred W. Worrell, Cunard's victualling superintendent in New York, stood on the dock checking off the supplies: 6,650 tons of fuel oil, 5,000 tons of fresh water, 77,000 pounds of fresh meat, 27,500 pounds of poultry, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 66,000 pounds of potatoes, 33,000 pounds of fresh vegetables, 15,000 dozen eggs, 22,000 pounds of flour, 11,000 pounds of sugar, 1,300 gallons of milk, 1,110 boxes of assorted fresh fruit, and 4,400 quarts of ice cream. When she came into port, 80,000 pieces of soiled linen had to be laundered and returned. On an average voyage, particularly after a rough crossing, up to 3,000 pieces of crockery and glassware had to be replaced. As the Queen sailed for England on her first turnaround, it was Captain Illingworth's last trip. He was ending 40 years of Cunard service as a Commodore in retirement. Captain G.C. Cove was appointed the Mary's new skipper. He was on a Christmas-New Year's holiday when the Queen Mary anchored in the roadstead off Cherbourg, France, January 1, 1949, under the command of her staff captain, Harry Grattridge. She was there to take on 500 passengers for a westbound voyage. Cherbourg is a shallow port, and no quay is available for the Queen Mary to tie up. The ravages of war were still noticeable in the harbor. Winds up to 80 miles an hour buffeted the harbor. With his passengers safely on board, Captain Grattridge ordered the anchor hoisted. He watched from the bridge as the anchor detail struggled to get the anchor up. It was snarled in steel webbing of a German submarine net which had been destroyed by an Allied landing party in 1944 and lay on the harbor's bottom. The wind suddenly shifted the Mary's stern, and Captain Grattridge heard a sickening scraping sound. The Queen Mary, the second largest ship afloat, was hard aground on a sandbar in front of the Chavagnac fort at the harbor entrance. The 1,740 passengers had settled back for a pleasant voyage to America. Charles Lofton and Myra Hess sat in the main lounge chatting over tea. To everyone, except the crew, everything seemed normal. Captain Gratridge asked for French tugs to come out and tow the 81,237-ton vessel off the sandbar. 3 tugs braved the winds, but the huge ship wouldn't budge. The passengers were told there might be a slight delay, so Dame Hess and Benno Moisewicz volunteered to give a piano concert in the main lounge to entertain the passengers. Senior baggage master Alec Harry Peerless winced. Dame Hess wanted her piano delivered from her stateroom to the lounge stage. Peerless had spent hours maneuvering the grand piano into her stateroom. Lofton gave one of his famous readings of the Bible, but nothing moved the mountain sitting on the sandbar. At high tide the next morning, the Mary was still stranded. She lay in a position where only her stern section was aground. Her forward section was afloat, keeping the mammoth Mary from listing. The winds had died down, and now 16 tugs strained to free her. When she was refloated, Captain Gratridge sailed for Southampton, 90 miles across the English Channel, where she was docked until divers could go under the stern section and inspect her for damage. The Queen Elizabeth was in dry dock, undergoing a periodic overhaul. Workmen were preparing to pull the Elizabeth's propellers, but the work was cancelled because Cunard feared she might have to be pulled out of dry dock and put into service if the Mary's damages were extensive, and the Mary might need the dry dock space. Berthed nearby was the Caronia, Cunard's new 34,183-ton liner, preparing for her maiden voyage. Some of the Mary's passengers accepted Cunard's offer to sail on the Caronia, but she was too small to take all the Queen's passengers. The underwater inspection showed leaks in the stern section. To plug them, Cunard poured 100 tons of special quick-drying cement into the breach. The cement had to be mixed topside, hauled below in buckets, and poured into the spot where the ship was leaking. It took 4,000 bucket loads to seal the puncture. The Caronia sailed January 4th with 686 passengers on her maiden voyage to New York. The Queen Mary, her leak plugged, sailed the next day. She steamed past the Caronia 2 days later and beat her into New York. But even her speed wasn't fast enough for many travelers. Cunard was beginning to feel the pinch of air travel competition, and even the new Cunard slogan, "Getting there is half the fun," wasn't blocking the new mode of getting there in a hurry. For most passengers, a voyage on the Queen Mary was too much food, too much service, and too much luxury in a fast-moving world of the 1950s. The United States had laid the keel on a new $72 million, 990-foot superliner with an all-aluminum superstructure that would give the ship the capability of 36 knot speeds. But those were uncharted storms that the Queen Mary wasn't yet sailing into. Strikes, impenetrable fogs, gales, and storms at sea were realities she was now facing. In the Atlantic in December 1951, the sea was a boiling cauldron. Ships were breaking up at sea. The Queen Mary was plowing through a hurricane-force wind. Tables, chairs, dishes, and glassware were being hurled about. A passenger was spilled out of his chair after it slid across the veranda grill and smashed against a bulkhead. He came up sputtering and still clutching the arm of his smashed chair. A waiter, also picking himself off the deck, quipped, "Souvenir, sir." Seawater had sloshed through the open ports into the R-deck main restaurant, 8 stories up. Crewmen, on their hands and knees, sopped up the seawater with towels and squeezed the water into galvanized buckets while a few brave patrons ate dinner. Captain Gratridge, now the Mary's skipper, was one who braved the dining room. He had raised his fork to his mouth when an apple zoomed past his ear and smashed against the stainless steel serving bar to the left of the captain's table. The steward cried, "Goal, sir!" Captain Gratridge said the December voyage was the worst he had made since he went to sea in 1941. "There is no other word for the seas than terrific," he said in describing how white water washed over the Mary's massive bow. Not all threats of storms were at sea in the 1950s. Captain Gratridge discovered he had invited Andrei Gromyko along with American and British military personnel to his cabin for a cocktail party at a time when the Korean War was raging. He found himself in the middle of a sticky political situation, but his tiger, Albert S.G. Marwick, quickly solved what could have been an embarrassing blunder. Captain Gratridge collected wind-up animals as a hobby, and he had his cabin lined with walking bears, hopping rabbits, and the like. Marwick busied himself winding up the menagerie to entertain the guests. They soon forgot their competing ideologies, Marwick said, while crawling around the deck like children, watching a bear that poured himself a drink every few steps. Marwick had more problems than entertaining the opposing atomic powers. Many passengers were under the mistaken belief that it was Marwick, as the captain's personal steward, who picked the 6 who shared the captain's table at dinner. Picking his table is a privilege so sacred, Marwick said, that not even Cunard dared dictate his choice. Captain Gratridge always liked to have 3 ladies and 3 gentlemen at his table with himself as the 7th. Marwick found himself constantly fending off offers to place a certain person at the captain's table. It was a delicate task of refusing without offending. The British are masters at saying no without offending, however. Cunard's stewards were masters at being servants without being servile, and the British as a whole are masters at accepting the inevitable with complete grace. Cunard and the Queen Mary were about to be put to that test. In July 1952, the sleek new American superliner United States, under the command of Commodore Harry Manning, sailed out of New York just behind the Queen Elizabeth for the ship's maiden voyage. The Queen Mary, about the same hour, was sailing from Southampton. At 5 p.m., July 6, 1952, Captain Gratridge announced over the ship's loudspeaker, "The United States, on her maiden voyage, is passing to our starboard." The Queen Mary's passengers, mostly Americans, rushed to the starboard rails to watch the shiny new ship steam toward Southampton, 7 miles north of the Queen Mary's path. Captain Gratridge sounded the Queen Mary's horn and ordered her colors dipped in a salute to the new ship. She was saluting the victor. When the United States arrived in Southampton, she had crossed in 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes, and had claimed the blue ribbon for the United States for the first time in 100 years. The last American ship to hold the title was the Pacific, which crossed in 9 days, 19 hours, and 25 minutes in 1851. Manning refused to fly the broom from the mast as a signal of victory when the ship entered Southampton, because he felt the signal, dating back to 1652, when Dutch Admiral Martin Harpertzoon Tromp sailed defiantly up the English Channel after a battle with the British, with only a broom for a mast, would be an insult to the British. Especially, Manning said, since we took the blue ribbon from such a gallant and lovely lady as the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary had lost the coveted title of the fastest ship afloat. She would never again regain the blue ribbon. But in August 1966, after her fate was already sealed, she beat her 1938 crossing time. She was no longer the fastest, but she was still the choice of most veteran ship travelers, but even they were thinning out. King George VI had died in 1952, and England had a new crown head, Queen Elizabeth II. Her coronation was scheduled in May 1953. The Archbishop of Canterbury was returning to England on the Queen Mary to officiate at the ceremonies. Don Valenti, an ex-boxer who ran the Queen's Gymnasium, helped the rotund bishop onto a vibrating machine and started the mechanism. The primate was jerked suddenly, and he tumbled off head first. "I couldn't sleep for 3 nights, Valenti recalled, worrying that I had wrecked the coronation. What could have proved a more serious royal disaster involving the Queen Mary occurred in New York in November 1954. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had been visiting the United States and Canada and was returning home aboard the Mary. The Queen's skipper, Captain Donald Sorrell, had been replaced for the voyage by a Cunard Commodore, former Mary skipper Harry Gratridge. The crew felt this was an insult to their captain and called a strike. When Captain Sorrell got wind of the strike, he called the protest leaders to his cabin and in his gentle Welsh way explained that protocol called for the Cunard Commodore to take command of the ship when any member of the royal family was aboard. That nipped the strike. In 1956, the Queen Mary inadvertently became involved in an international child custody case that pitted the United States against Russia. Alex Trostov, a Russian, booked passage on the ship for himself and his American-born daughter, Tanya, too. He was returning to Russia by way of England. His divorced wife had legal custody of the child, and she filed a kidnapping charge against Trostov. Immigration officers searched the ship for the child, but could not find her or Trostov. The Queen Mary sailed, and Trostov came out of hiding. By the time the Queen Mary reached Southampton, it was a full-blown international crisis between the United States and Russia, with Great Britain in the middle. The British barred Trostov from taking Tanya from England until the British courts could decide the U.S. claims that Tanya, an American citizen, was being taken to Russia against the wishes of her mother, who had legal custody. The court ruled in favor of the mother. The ship was still having troubles rolling in heavy seas. Cunard ordered the ship placed in dry dock and installed 4 wing-shaped stabilizers amidships. The stabilizers, 2 on either side, had an outreach of 12.5 feet and were 7 feet 3 inches in width. Each pair of stabilizers worked independently of the other and were controlled from the bridge. The provided passenger comfort was long in coming. Cunard in April 1959 began discussions on building a new liner to replace the aging Queen Mary. By November 1960, the British government announced it was giving Cunard a direct grant of $9.1 million and a low-interest loan for $43.3 million for the construction of that new ship. The French had finished their new liner, the France. She was on her maiden voyage, February 2nd, 1961, when she crossed parallel with the Queen Mary. The Mary flashed, "You are a lovely lady." The France replied, "But you'll always be a queen." But her days as a queen of the seas were numbered. In October 1963, Cunard board chairman, Sir John Brocklebank, announced the steamship company would build a 58,000-ton, 2,000-passenger, 960-foot liner to replace the Queen Mary. Sir Brocklebank also announced a desperate move for the old Greyhound of the Atlantic. He said the Queen Mary would be used for winter cruises to Lisbon, Madeira, and Las Palmas for Christmas 1963. Using passenger ships for cruises to exotic ports was the steamship company's answer to the slipping profits lost to airlines. Even though the Queen Mary proved a popular ship for cruising, she was too big and too awkward to get in and out of small ports. Also, she was not air-conditioned, except in the public rooms, and that system, even though at the time it was installed was the biggest air conditioning plant in the world, was often faulty. Perhaps the most ignominious incident in the life of the Queen occurred when she came into New York Harbor in 1964 and was cited by the New York Air Pollution Control for belching too much black smoke out of her funnels. The ship was fined $100 for the smoke violation on November 11, 1964. She was not only smoking too much, but the oil that created that smoke was costing too much. The Queen Mary, the ship that almost bankrupted Cunard in her construction, was now bankrupting the company by her operation. She was costing an average of $50,000 a day to keep her in service. She was losing up to $2 million a year on the North Atlantic run. By December 30th, 1964, her doom was sealed. Cunard signed a contract with John Brown Shipyards to build the Q4, the Queen Mary's replacement. This sleek, slim model would be used for around-the-world cruises by sliding easily through the Panama or Suez canals. The Queen Mary's Victorian spread of 118 feet couldn't. The keel of the new vessel was laid in July 1965 as Cunard celebrated its 125th anniversary. The new ship would burn only 500 tons of oil a day, and yet could carry as many passengers as the Queen Mary, but never in her style. The passengers on the Queen's later voyages were of her era, mostly older people, steeped in tradition, and resisting the fast mode of jet travel. They were not as chic as her passengers once were, and not as many either. As few as 800 were making the crossing, and the 1,100 crewmen were stumbling over each other trying to serve them. In the 1960s, jet travel had eroded deeply into the ship's travel market. Economy class flights from New York to London were $300. Tourist class on Queen Mary was $496, discounted to $420 during the off-season. First class jet travel was $712.50, while the Queen's fare started at $946. The Queen Mary had always feared being sunk by an airplane, not a submarine, bemoaned the ship's printer Jim Hawkins, and now it's finally happened. She had lived a charmed life, but now she was in troubled waters. She was living in the twilight of a way of life, too big, too costly, and too old. She could not recapture the joie de vivre of the past. This ship had not changed. The world had. The swinging 60s were the jet-set era. This was no place for a queen. She was now 30 years old, sagging and creaking with age, and showing rust lines in her steel complexion. She was that way in May 8, 1966, at sea headed for New York, when her new skipper, a Welshman named John Treasure Jones, who had only taken her command in February, opened a sealed message from Cunard headquarters. It told Captain Jones that the ship would be taken out of service and sold. To the silver-haired captain, it was a direct blow, a particularly painful message. He had first served aboard the Queen Mary as her first officer in 1953, and later as staff captain, and finally her master. The last ship Jones had skippered was the Mauretania II. He had taken her to the shipbreakers at Inverkeithing in December 1965. I walked down the gangway without looking back at her, he said. I could not bear looking at a ship that was to be broken up. The Queen Mary, he thought, was now facing the breaker's hammer. End of Chapter 7. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and comment below. For more stories on the architecture, engineering, and history of the Steam Age, make sure to subscribe. You can support me by either becoming a Patreon member or channel member, or you can help donate to my transatlantic voyage to the UK. Links and information are in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.